The goal today is to talk a little bit about psychology's historical roots. We want to look at the shift that happened in the late 19th century towards empiricism, towards taking a scientific approach to studying the mind that has, over the last century plus morphed into what we now know today as psychological science. So we're going to touch on some of the historical disciplines being structuralism, functionalism, Gestalt psychology. We're going to briefly touch on behaviorism and psychoanalysis because those are two approaches that we still look at in modern day. So we'll talk about them a little bit more when we get to our modern approaches. So to first touch on women who broke into the field of psychology, it's really interesting to note that between 1997 and 2017, 10 of the 20 presidents of the American Psychological Association have been female. But we've got to look back to the 19th century when women were first starting to enter the field. Mary Whiton Calkins was actually a student of William James, who we're going to talk about today. When she joined his seminar at Harvard, all of the men dropped out. So William James actually tutored her alone. She ended up becoming the first female president of the American Psychological Association. Margaret Floyd Washburn, despite being a student of Titchener, who we're also talking about today, was excluded from belonging to the Experimental Psychologists Association. However, was the first woman to earn a PhD in psychology and was also the second female president of the American Psychological Association. So the exercise that we're going to do now is actually going to introduce you to a concept that we're going to talk about next. So all I want you to do is go to, it should be page 8 in your notebook. You will see a little YouTube video at the top that looks, that is actually the same song that I'm about to play for you. And all you're going to do now, I'm going to play the song, you're going to close your eyes and listen. When you're finished, I'm going to ask you to type into your notebook kind of everything that you were feeling or thinking about as you were listening to the song. Okay, so at this point, pause the video, go over to your notebook, and just write down everything you felt. Any emotions, thoughts, memories. So it's always really interesting when I play that song in class because I get a really wide variety of responses from students. I have students who say the song makes them feel anxious, others who say it's totally calming. There was an article that came out several years ago. Some psychological scientists actually looked at this song and determined it to be like one of the most calming songs that a person can listen to. I had the complete opposite experience. It reminds me of the theme from Stranger Things, which I've never finished the series because it kind of freaks me out. I'm sure some of you love it, but the whole point is that what we just engaged in is a process known as introspection, or kind of a self-reporting or self-reflection of how a particular stimulus, in this case a song, makes us feel. So when we study sensation and perception, we're going to learn that the process of sensation is the actual taking in of information from our environment. So in other words, we're able to hear the song. However, our perception is all very individual and unique to us as individuals, because our perception relies on our previous experiences. It's why you and I can both hear the same song and walk away with completely different emotions and thoughts and maybe even memories that have been evoked. So we just engaged in this process of introspection, or this self-reporting or self-reflection. The reason that I had to do that is because the very first psychology lab that was opened by Wilhelm Wundt in 1879 relied on this process of introspection. Wilhelm Wundt's first psychology lab studied the basic structures of the mind. So he would, for example, have an individual press a telegraph key after hearing a ball hit a platform. And he would track how long their reaction time was, but also how long it took them for them to become conscious of the fact that they had heard the sound, which is actually a little bit of a lag compared to the reaction time. But the point is, think about how, a chemist would study the periodic table, like the individual elements. This was Wundt's approach to the mind, was studying these individual components of our consciousness. Now, one of the big criticisms of introspection that I want you to remember is this notion that it's so subjective. When the behaviorists come along, they are going to pitch a completely different idea for how we should study human behavior. They believe we should focus only on what is observable, which is the opposite of what Wundt is doing here. He's asking people to report things that are very subjective and things that we're not able to observe and that are very difficult to measure, that we're going to learn this year just how fascinating it is the way that researchers are able to empirically, methodically define things like happiness, for example, so that they're able to study it. But the criticism of structuralism at the time was this introspection or the self-reporting was just too subjective. G. Stanley Hall was a student of Wundt. He establishes the first psychology lab here in the United States. Wundt's lab was in Germany. Here's another little example of introspection. Think about what you see here. Okay. So, is it a beach or is it a door? It's actually like the trim of a door. Just another example of how two people can see the same thing and yet have different perceptions or report different perceptions. And we're going to look at lots more examples of these kinds of illusions this year. So, around the time of Wundt's lab being open, along comes William James, who's an American. Instead of studying the individual components of consciousness, James is interested in how the consciousness functions. He wants to know to what extent is our consciousness, meaning our awareness, a product of adaptation. Think about our emotions, for example. Think about fear. I mean, this is very much an adaptive response that we have because it's important that we experience fear so that we're able to protect ourselves. Fear is necessary for the survival of the species. So fear is an adaptive response, and we're actually going to meet a woman via a podcast this year who has no ability to experience fear. And you'll see what the implications of that are. But whereas Wundt is concerned with studying the individual components of the consciousness separately, things like sensation and perception and memory, James is more interested in the functioning and of the consciousness and how it is a product of adaptation. Our Gestalt psychologists, we're going to talk more about when we study perception, but they're interested in how we construct perceptual wholes. Here's some examples of some Gestalt principles. This is the law of similarity. I want you to think for a second. What do you see here? Rows or columns? You see columns because the Gestalt law of similarity holds that we are likely to group together and see as a whole objects that are similar to one another. Here's another example of a Gestalt principle, and that is that of closure. There are no borders to this. There are no boundaries to this triangle, yet we see it as a triangle. The brain fills in the gaps. So Gestalt psychologists are interested in how our brain kind of fills in gaps and innately is programmed to group objects together that are similar. Let's try this one. What do we notice here? A lot of times students will get the mouth but not the eyes, because this is true of faces as well. When we look at someone's face, we don't see them as a collection of their facial features. We see their face as a whole and are able to recognize them as a person. All right, and just to finish this up, I said we're going to talk more about this when we get into our modern approaches, but behaviorism is very much starkly contrasted with Wundt's structuralism, because like I was saying, John Watson, who in the 20th century founds behaviorism, says that psychology can only deal with observable behavior. So within this school, we're going to learn about John Watson, we're going to learn about Pavlov and B.F. Skinner, and this notion that we can only study that which we can observe. Thoughts, not observable. We want to know if a kid raises their hand in class, how does the consequence that they receive from the teacher influence the likelihood that they're going to raise their hand in class again? So we're going to talk about things like reinforcement and punishment and how consequences, observable consequences, drive observable behaviors. And that brings us to Sigmund Freud, which probably every AP psychology student comes in expecting to spend the year studying. We don't talk a whole lot about Freud because Freud's approach was very unscientific, particularly given the degree of empiricism that is used in psychology today. But Freud's school of psychoanalysis was very much focused on, first of all, pathology, meaning mental disorders. He was really interested in noting what was, quote, wrong with someone. And his view was that any type of abnormality in the personality was a product of conflicts in the person's unconscious mind. So the unconscious meaning the part of our mind that we're not aware of. And he said that these conflicts stem from experiences that we have in our childhood. So that's it for today. Next thing we will get into are the modern approaches to psychology.